Let's take a look at 5.7. What were the challenges relating to equality, equity, and civil protests? Okay, starting with equality. The apartheid system had created one of the most unequal societies on the planet. It was kind of the whole point of this system. And changing that's going to take some serious time and effort. It's not going to happen very quickly. And so poverty and inequality were still problems of South Africa in 2001, still a problem today. As of 2001, 57% of the population was under the poverty line, kind of the root definition of the amount of money it takes in order to be defined as poor. So a majority of the country is defined as below the poverty line, as kind of very poor. And in those first 10 years, it gets worse. The gap between rich and poor widens. By 2000, however, inequality was no longer clearly defined by race. And what that means is that there were starting to be a rising black middle class. And so some black people were starting to get some wealth. And however, the majority were not. The majority of black people have a ways to go. But it wasn't clearly if you're black or white, that means you're poor or not. But the majority of Africans still deal with this crushing poverty. 5% of Africans reach middle class status, but the majority is still struggling. And so here we see a bit of the gender gap and the race gap involved today, where the black population is making, on average, $20 per hour. A mixed population, on average, is closer to 30. Indian population, closer to 50. And then the white population, probably around 70. And these are in rands, not dollars, are they? There's also the gender gap, a little bit between men and women. But the racial divide is much more clear when it comes to 20 versus 70. An extra $50 per hour based on race. They got a ways to go. Land ownership is one of the leading causes of this inequality, because most farmland was owned by white commercial farmers. So the best farms, the best land, and most of the land was owned by whites. And this is a legacy of colonialism when they came in and took over in 1600. But also it's a more recent development in the apartheid complete removal of 4 million Africans when they were shipped off to the Bantustans and their farms were taken. And so serious change needs to be had as far as land ownership only be controlled by whites. And so the government hoped to bring land reform with redistribution, in which they would give money to poor Africans to buy land, but also restitution, where if you were a white farmer and you had to give up your land, the government would pay you for that land. So they're hoping to buy land from white farmers, give it to Africans, and help to balance things out. Their overall goal was to have 30% owned by black farmers in the first 5 years. And it's an ambitious goal that they did not achieve. They set up a land courts commission to investigate any claims that if land was stolen by whites at some point, it should be given back. And a lot of these cases went for the land claims court to kind of settle these disputes. The Constitution guaranteed property rights, however. They can't, going back to John Locke, the government can't necessarily just take away your property unless there was a problem. And so they couldn't just seize land and take it. And so the disputes really depended on the willingness of the white owners to sell that land. If the government was willing to give a good deal to sell the land to the government, and the government would then give the land to Africans. And so whites were still kind of in control of the land for the majority there. In the end, their goal of 30% failed. They only got 2% land relocated back to black farmers in the first 5 years. By 2003, only 16% of land is owned by black farmers, and that's mostly held by the top chiefs, these traditional rulers in the former Bantustans. So they got a ways to go when it comes to black ownership and black farms. As far as protest movements, it is lightened up. There's a long history of these civil society protests, like the ANC and other groups. In the 80s, we had the Institute for Democracy in South Africa, and it was established to think about democratic alternatives to apartheid, think about the next steps as far as what the government's going to look like next. But once change happened, they are not doing as well. 1990 to 1994, They ran a lot of programs to allow the old and the new orders to kind of work together to build new democratic structures as people were welcomed back and banishments were lifted. In 1994, they created, their goal was creating a new culture of democracy. But a lot of these organizations are weakened after 94 because a lot of their leaders become the government. And so they have less to protest because they are the government now. There are a couple of different protest groups that worked for a more healthy democracy, such as the Treatment Action Campaign, which they serve as a watchdog group to watch the government and defend civil rights. And they appealed to the Constitutional Court to force the government to supply antiretroviral medication to HIV-infected people. We also get the Landless Peoples Project, which focuses on the rights of farm workers and the need for land reform. Tensions within the government and the different parties within the government. So before 1994, the ANC, the Communists, and the Unions formed the Tripartite Alliance. This kind of three-way alliance of their top leaders. And so Joe Slovo and Chris Hani were leaders within the Communist Party and were essential in negotiations. Same with Cyril Ramaphosa. He was essential, he was from the unions and very important to these negotiations. And some of the big ideas of the new government, such as proportional representation and presidential term limits, were suggested by the unions. And the communist and union members were given key positions in the interim government. But once the ANC took over, things changed. And even in the 90s, the unions had several strikes to put pressure on the government to give the workers more rights. But once the ANC takes over, they start to turn against the workers a little bit and push for more pure capitalism. And we start to see these splits and weakening of this alliance. The Growth, Employment, and Reconstruction Program focused on free market capitalism and growing the economy, and to have a stronger, more free market economy. However, that doesn't necessarily translate to more workers' rights. And a lot of these earlier promises of giving land to the poor and helping the poor necessarily, the ANC changed a bit. And so the communists and the unions saw this as the ANC moving away from their earlier promises of the Freedom Charter and equality. And 98, Mandela and Mbeki, they turn against the communists and the unions, and they publicly censure them. They kind of slap them on the wrist, say, hey, you don't get to talk to us. You don't get to criticize our government. And so the unions and the communists, they can leave this alliance if they wanted to, but if they did, they would just be much weaker. So instead, they try to maintain whatever ties they can and keep whatever influence they have. And that's it.